1 in 5 people in the world live on less than $1 a day. Can global poverty be substantially reduced? Addressing global poverty, coming up next on Great Decisions 2005.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation, Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and Citigroup Private Bank. And now, from our Washington, D.C. studio, here is Peter Krogh.
During the last decade, poverty has been reduced in most regions of the world, save sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Where gains have been made in East and South Asia, for example, economic growth has been the principal driver. Global spending on the war against poverty currently amounts to roughly $60 billion annually. The U.S. is currently the largest single country donor, but the smallest when measured as a percentage of gross national product. Simply put, the country with the world's largest economy is, when it comes to foreign aid, the stingiest. When polled, the American people believe that we are spending 10% of our federal budget on foreign aid. There is a yawning gap between myth and reality. Recently, both the United Nations and the United States announced new initiatives to tackle poverty. The American initiative, entitled the Millennium Challenge Account, aims to concentrate aid on countries which meet criteria of good government, economic management, and transparency. Outside the realm of national governments and international organizations, there are a host of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, with development agendas of their own. They are extraordinarily active, but it is not clear that they are always helpful or productive. Meanwhile, those mired in poverty, in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, seem to have no way out.
We cannot accept a world in which there's so much wealth and at the same time, so many people living in abject poverty.
Their geographic location, isolated from the main lines of global commerce and communication, topographical barriers, climates featuring increasing water shortages and internal conflicts have left them falling behind. Where do we stand in the battle against global poverty today? Which approaches seem to work best? And is there any hope for the poorest of the poor? Joining me to discuss these questions are Carol Lancaster, former Deputy Administrator for USAID and Professor of International Affairs at the Walsh School of Foreign Service, and Sebastian Mallaby, columnist for the Washington Post and author of the recent publication, The World's Banker, a story of failed states, financial crises, and the wealth and poverty of nations. Carol and Sebastian, thank you for joining us on Great Decisions 2005. As I pointed out in the introduction, rather substantial progress in combating poverty has been made in some regions of the world, particularly in East and South Asia. Sebastian, what explains their progress, and is there anything we can learn from those regions of the world about the alleviation of poverty?
Well, I think you said it right. I mean, poverty has gone down where economic growth has gone up. And these two things are very, very closely correlated. You've had almost very, very few examples, I think, in the last 50 years of substantial growth without poverty reduction or substantial poverty reduction without growth. So the idea that you can do poverty reduction by redistributing the existing pie has been sort of tested and found wanting. So the question is, how do you get the economic growth? And there I think that is a combination of the sort of pro-market agenda, which was popular in the 1980s, which was part of the answer, but not all of it. And then secondly, the one in the 1990s, which is more to do with governance, to do with sound institutions, some transparency, and an effort to contain corruption, and basically having public institutions that can deliver policies. It's not just good enough to have the right broadly pro-growth policies, but you have to be able to implement them as well.
Carol, has Sebastian got that about right? Is this what's been underpinning growth and poverty reduction in East and South Asia?
Yes, I think he's gotten it pretty much right. I would just add one thing, a detail, that particularly in China, poverty reduction and growth have been driven to a considerable extent by private investment. And the conditions that Sebastian talked about, good governance, And I would add a reasonable amount of education and health in the population.
An emphasis on literacy.
Literacy, people who can work in an effective, productive, and disciplined manner are all very important. But I think the private investment part of it is also a key thing, and that was key in India too. We can see it really happening there now.
Well, meanwhile, Carol, over the years, quite a lot of foreign aid has been dispensed, but the results have often been disappointing. I think a while back you wrote a book, or at least an article, entitled Why So Much Aid and So Little Development. What have been our problems in getting aid effectively distributed to those who can make best use of it? What has been the historical problem there?
There are a couple of problems, some of them on the side of the donors and some of them on the side of the recipients. On the donor side, let's take the United States. We have provided aid for a variety of reasons, not just for development. Yet we judge the outcomes almost entirely in terms of development. So when we provide aid for diplomatic purposes to countries that
give most of it per capita to Israel, for example.
To Israel and to Egypt. We've given a lot in the past to places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo under the former dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. That I don't think we can expect a whole lot of outcome when governance is poor. And that takes us to the recipients. And I think if you have the conditions that Sebastian talked about, corruption, institutions that are weak, and so on, that can really make it very difficult for aid to be productive or to be sustainable. So I think that's a big problem.
Our aid has also frequently been tied to purchases in this country. I think 70% of our foreign aid is tied to purchases in this country, which kind of lowers the bang for the buck, doesn't it, Sebastian?
Yeah, and in a more profound way than one might think. It sounds as though, well, the problem with tied aid is simply that the recipient country may not get the best deal for the money and may, for example, have to buy, some American equipment rather than Japanese equipment, even though the Japanese might be better. But actually, the real problem with tied aid is bigger than that, and it has to do with the fact that in poor countries you've got limited administrative capacity, and that means a shortage of skilled people in the government. And if they have to deal with complicated rules that come attached to every single development budget, they have no time to actually govern. So, the Tanzanians sit there.
All the regulations and forms that need to be completed.
Right, and so one day the procurement person in the Ministry of Finance is receiving the Danish delegation, and then hot on its heels comes the another Scandinavian one, and the US one, and the Germans and the Japanese, and then it's the World Bank, and then and there's literally no time to actually figure out what the challenges are for the company. For the country, the red tape accompanied with foreign aid can be truly remarkable.
Carol, does this argue for the greater international coordination of aid? Yes, bilateral programs, but within an internationally coordinated framework, so that maybe you only have to fill out one form.
Yes, there's quite a lot of international coordination right now, although it hasn't gotten to the points of just filling out one form. I would like to say just one thing about what Sebastian said. I mean, it's obviously more efficient to have untied aid. But foreign aid is provided in a political context in the donor country. And one of the things every aid-given government has to do is create a domestic political coalition large enough to support that aid program year after year. And tied aid is one of the ways of doing that. That ties in the business community. Obviously, it's a second-best solution, but it has a purpose, and it has played a role. I think, though, there's been a lot of progress toward coordination. It can only go so far for most governments, including the United States, because the U.S. government wants to be able to be accountable for specific activities it has funded.
And take credit for those.
And take credit. And the Congress wants that, too. So it's very difficult to go the final step in sort of putting your aid into some kind of pool with all the other aid donors, which is what's happening with some governments, and then just fill out one paper and let it go. I think this is very hard for some governments, not just the United States, but the Japanese government and the French government and others.
I would add that the only entity that can really impose donor coordination is actually the recipient government, because no one donor will be accepted by the other donors as the keeper of the ring. And therefore, that's why aid works in countries which do have functioning government institutions. That's why China and India have done better than some countries in Africa which have very weak institutions. And the exceptions in Africa, I went to Uganda last year, which is a place that cut poverty by 40% in the 1990s. And the reason, I think, had to do with a very powerful team of technocrats in the finance ministry, which had gone from nothing to really some substantial capability by the end of the 90s, which was willing to say to some donors, sorry, go away. We're not interested in you. And was willing to actually impose discipline on donors to some extent. And it took extraordinary force of character, and it came down to one senior technocrat in the finance ministry who was a sort of larger-than-life, hard-drinking, big guy who would sort of bang the table, and had the guts and the intellectual force
to say no to money.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
What doesn't make you stronger makes you weaker in the aid business.
Sebastian, you've written a book on the World Bank. Such positive traction has been gained against the fight on poverty. Has the World Bank been a positive contributor to that traction?
Well, the interesting thing about that question is how hard it is to answer it. I mean, development by its nature is sort of a partnership between a lot of different players. If something goes right, like Uganda's poverty reduction in the 1990s, the credit goes primarily to the Ugandan government, also to its partners that gave it ideas, that gave it finance, and those include the World Bank. I think the World Bank was definitely the leading donor, both in terms of technical ideas and in money terms. But it's very hard to put your finger, on who precisely is responsible for what. I went to Uganda and I interviewed all the technocrats in the Ugandan government who had dealt with donors and said, well, how did the World Bank help you? Can you name some instances? And they did come up with some micro instances, and I'll tell you one which is kind of cute. They had noticed that although the central government education budget had gone up a lot, local schools were not actually getting the money. Something was happening. And the World Bank helped to design a survey where it sent teams of Ugandan surveyors off to the villages to look at the schools and ask, well, how much did you get? And the answer was the median school in this survey got 0% of what it was supposed to get from the central government for its education. And because it was being taken by the middle people in the government, by the kind of regional level in the government. So then having got those results, they put notices on the school board so that the parent associations could see what the school was supposed to have gotten. And then this mobilized political pressure locally, and then the money started to flow. And so that transparency was a way of fighting corruption. It took the World Bank to design this survey, to do the spreadsheets that made the data work and so forth. But so you can find these micro examples of how the bank can help. But if you ask in the big picture, China has reduced poverty a lot. How much did the bank contribute to that? It's a mixture. It's a partnership between the bank and other donors and the Chinese. And so it's pretty difficult to give you a simple answer.
Carol, do you generally give the World Bank high marks?
I think the World Bank has done a lot of good things in the development business and tried very hard as well. And it's a little bit freer than individual governments to focus exclusively on development. It has, I think, also had some of the problems of a very large bureaucracy, a very large sort of inward-focused bureaucracy, so that it hasn't always been as sensitive to its environment as people would have wished.
And it issues a lot of reports.
Well, everybody issues a lot of reports.
Your former publication said, let them eat reports. I mean, as if reports could do development.
Well, some reports are useful, and others are probably not very useful, and certainly there are a lot of both. But I think it's, I think it's made a credible effort to make a difference.
Meanwhile, Carol, there's this new Millennium Challenge account that was established, I think, 2 years ago by the Bush administration. It has rather strict criteria for the dispensing of aid, criteria that include good governance, good economic management, no corruption, educational program for girls, things that we want to highlight. Is this a good program, or are we going to be excluding some potentially worthy nations along the way here?
I think in base it's a good idea, and I think it's remarkable, a remarkable initiative by the first Bush administration. It does try to direct a significant amount of aid, new money, towards highly developmental goals on a selective basis, recognizing that if you drop the money in countries that are corrupt and can't handle it, you're going to waste the money. However, I would say a couple of things. First of all, it is still yet to disperse $1.
Really?
It is still working on getting itself up and running. Now, it hasn't been in business for very long. It was the idea.
It's spending its money on itself?
Well, but, it takes a while to get things going. I think we have to watch and see how long it's going to take for the money to go out the door. Second, people are starting to think, okay, the criteria for being part of this are good, but there are sort of there's a leeway, and one country has just been added, Georgia, which doesn't actually fit the corruption criteria as much as one would like, so we hope they're going to keep the standards, but we don't know. I think it's too soon to say how this is really going to work.
Well, suppose you're coming out of being a failed state. You've just solved an internal conflict, and you're groping for the future, and you've got a couple of good things going. You certainly wouldn't be a candidate for the Millennium Challenge account, would you be? And shouldn't they allow some people in who have a credible plan in one area? No corruption. Let's have that be a common denominator. But beyond that, maybe you could have a two-tiered arrangement. Sebastian?
Well, I agree with that, but the way to do that is not to dilute the Millennium Challenge account, which has these fixed criteria, but to use
more bucks.
The other aid account. Well, we already have a system now with a new Millennium Challenge account, which is supposed to scale up towards $5 billion a year. But then we also have the old USAID, $10 billion a year or so, and those two combined form the U.S. foreign aid program. So you have a big account outside the Millennium Challenge account, which you can use to help these cases of a new reform. In fact, Georgia is a funny example of this, because Georgia did have its Rose Revolution, as they called it, 1 year ago, a new government, and the new ruler came in and basically fired the police force because it was totally corrupt, and tried to really turn over a new leaf. And when I wrote in the Washington Post recently that it was a bad thing to include Georgia on the list because it didn't meet the criteria, of course I was then inundated with protests by the pro-Georgia caucus, which said, but wait a minute, we used to be corrupt, and that's what
we just fired our police force.
But now we've really turned over a new leaf. And my response is, great, I'm glad you've turned over a new leaf. And when we do the next survey in 2 years, the data will show that you're not as corrupt as you used to be, and then you'll qualify. But you don't qualify now, and let's not twist the numbers up and twist the objectivity of this new system by making political exceptions.
Carol, one of the criteria, I think, is a credible program of investing in education of young girls so that they can enter the workforce and also plan their families more wisely. Is this an important criterion, do you think? Is this where development really can take place if there are more women empowered and engaged?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. There's plenty of research that shows better educated women have fewer and healthier children. They can contribute to the labor force, as you say, and they can make a lot of other important contributions to their countries and have a more satisfying life. So, and girls are disadvantaged almost in every country you look at in the developing world. Fewer girls go to school for a whole lot of reasons. Parents' fears about security, the need for the girls to stay home, the sense that why educate girls? They're just going to go off and marry somebody and leave the household. But I think that's a huge mistake, and I think maybe this effort and others like it will encourage people to think again.
Sebastian, progress in Latin America on the poverty front has been rather disappointing as I read it. Poverty levels there have been kind of flat over the last 10 years, and yet we've had more democratic governments, more free markets, more engagement in international trade. Do you have any idea what's holding Latin America back?
I don't have the overall data in my head, but I do know that the places where poverty has come down, I'm pretty sure, Chile is an example of the extreme case of successful market reform and successful democratization, and poverty has plummeted. I think it's true to say that in Mexico, you've had some reduction in poverty, although it depends when you start measuring, because of the peso crash in 1995, end of 94, obviously reduced real wages, so there's a kind of statistical quirk there. But certainly since 96, I think there's been quite a big reduction in poverty in Mexico, again associated with basically pro-market policies, more democracy, and so on. So I wouldn't give up on the idea that there's a connection between democracy, market policies, and poverty reduction, even if it may be true, you seem to know better than I. If you look across the whole continent, it may be hard to pick that up.
Yes, I think Central America, for example, has been just practically stagnant. Well, let's turn to another big continent, Carol, your continent of Africa, because you also were Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. A fellow by the name of Jeffrey Sachs, who's famous in the aid community, is going around saying that we've just got to do something quite dramatic here because it's not their fault that they're poor, it's that they're just out of the way. and they've got bad climates, and they got too many mountains, and they've got too much disease, and we just have to really do something dramatic. Is this where we need to go to wrench Africa out of its backwardness?
I think there's some things we could do dramatically. We could spend a lot of money on some things, and perhaps usefully so. I mean, I think providing antiretrovirals is something that we could do that would at least stem the very high death rate of people suffering from HIV/AIDS. But I think that the barriers to African success, economic success, are, I think, less structural, less physical than they are institutional. And I think a lot of people would agree with this. Yes, Africa's out of the way. Yes, it's dry in some places, and there are a lot of countries that are landlocked. But some countries, like Botswana, have grown enormously over the last 10 or 15 years. I think the highest consistent growth rate in the world over the last 10 or 15 years has been that of Botswana, which is a little dry, landlocked country in southern Africa that is lucky enough to have diamonds, but also has been able to manage that money very well. A lot of countries in Africa have really rich resources and have been disasters, but not Botswana. And I think that suggests that under the right circumstances, they can make it too, and that the tropical climates and so on is not an insuperable barrier. And you really have to have human beings who are committed to making it work. And I think we're still struggling with that in a lot of parts of Africa.
It's worth going on that one, going back to the 1960s, and remembering that at that time, it was often said that it was Asia that was a completely hopeless case. It would never grow out of poverty. The population
too many people.
Exactly, it was way too high.
Yeah.
So, and there was
basket cases, we used to call
And there was
them.
a lot of optimism about Africa. So people would compare Ghana, which had huge, great hopes, and South Korea, which was regarded as a hopeless one. And so I think these over too much pessimism and too much determinism about development is a great mistake. And if you get the governance right, if you get this political factor right, a government that wants to do development, that is not corrupt, and that can administer a competent program, amazing things can happen. I mean, you couldn't have thought of a worst basket case in Uganda in the late 80s.
And how was it able to turn the corner? It wasn't just this one technocrat there, or the guy with the big hands and beating on the table. What was in that mix that worked particularly well for Uganda?
Well, it was a complicated cocktail. It started with having hit bottom. When you hit bottom, you've had wars and terrible dictators. In a way, it's easy to bounce up. Second thing was it was sort of an intelligent and enlightened strongman, Yoweri Museveni, who came to power in '86, pursued statist economic policies which completely failed for 1 year, then saw the light and realized he'd made a mistake, turned course, and did things like liberalizing coffee prices. There was then conveniently a boom in coffee prices, which delivered a lot of money into the hands of coffee farmers, who suddenly had all this revenue, and they could start to spend it to build new houses. If you look at southern Uganda in particular, you can see that the thatched roofs have disappeared and they've been covered with tiles. So it's a mixture of good fortune on coffee prices, a determined presidential leadership which sort of sees the light, and then these technocrats who kind of had the president's backing and were able to manage the aid community and, as you said, say no to money sometimes.
Carol, this brings us, the mention of coffee beans brings us, or at least me, back to agriculture. The world spends $300 billion a year on agricultural subsidies, rich country agricultural subsidies, $60 billion a year in aid. If we were to liberalize that agricultural market, really free up agriculture and bring it into globalization, wouldn't that be the most helpful thing we could do to reduce poverty on a global basis?
I think it would be helpful. I don't know that it would be I don't know what would be the most helpful thing, but certainly if we reduce cotton prices, that would open up the opportunity, or cotton subsidies, that would open up the opportunity for cotton farmers in Africa, in the Middle East, and elsewhere to sell more on the world market. Now, one of the things that would have to happen across the board would be the quality of agricultural produce in these countries would have to meet world standards, but that's something that can be easily worked on. But I do think that we are a little hypocritical when we tell other people to sort of follow market signals, and then we put subsidies on stuff that blocks their ability to do so.
And when we leave globalization incomplete, I mean, basically leave agriculture out of the global.
Right.
So is this completion of the Doha round and the free trade agreement associated with that, Sebastian? At the core of it is agriculture. Is that the most important development agenda item out there, would you say?
I think yes, I think you could argue that. I think that Doha is particularly important depending on what kind of Doha you get. If it's a Doha that not only opens northern markets, but also drives market liberalization and freer trade within the South, between poor countries, that will be very, very valuable. Because actually, if you look at economic simulations of where the benefits come for the poorest countries, a lot of the benefits, in fact, come from sort of, Brazil trading with its neighbors, or, inter-African trade. And there are a lot of obstacles to that at the moment, very high tariff rates, obstructing that natural sort of specialization that ought to be going on. And getting rid of that is almost as important, actually, as opening northern markets. So I think it's important that the Doha round should try and do both of those things.
Carol, Sebastian has done a little NGO bashing in his day, taking on the non-governmental organizations and questioning their role in the development process. I think he's gone overboard, this fellow?
I think he's over the top on that. I think he's sort of tarred them all with the same brush. He knows, I think, that because we've had this exchange before. I mean, I think there's an argument to be made that, who elected them to speak for everybody else? Who put them in the development business? Why do they have the right to tie up things for months and years that other people want to do to promote development? Some of that's true. On the other hand, it does seem to me that their voice has been important in a lot of ways for calling our attention to things that big bureaucracies can do without taking into account the interests of the people they're affecting. And so I really think we need a balanced view on this. And knowing that Sebastian is a reasonable man, I'm sure that in his heart he has a balanced view. I think they've played a useful role, but a role not to be exaggerated and to be kept within reasonable balance.
Well, the World Financial Institutions seem to live in fear and trembling of these non-governmental organizations. Should they, Sebastian? And we just have a few seconds. Have you gone over the top here?
I don't think I've gone over the top. I think I'm trying to make a sort of, I'm trying to correct things. I think they've gone over the top, some of these groups, not all of them, just a small minority. And, criticizing CBS 60 Minutes for using forged documents is not the same as attacking the First Amendment. And equally, I'm not attacking NGOs as a bloc. I'm just saying that a few of them have gone too far, and I don't regret saying that.
Sebastian Mallaby, Carol Lancaster, thank you for being on Great Decisions 2005. And thank you, our audience, for Great Decisions. I'm Peter Krogh.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.fpa.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, or a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Starr Foundation, the Morse Family Foundation, the William and Karen Tell Foundation, and Citigroup Private Bank.